right, so everybody, welcome to VMscare. I wanted to have a specifically intentionally inflammatory title to get everyone like, what are they going to talk about? So just for a little background, VMware, the popular kind of legacy virtualization technology company, was acquired by Broadcom from Dell for in the vicinity of $69 billion. Yeah, it's like 61 in cash and like 8 billion in debt or something like that. And that I was completed November. And since then, you've seen a lot of product lines being slashed, consolidated, lower tiers of things going away, and a lot of layoffs around more service-oriented services, I guess, that they were giving to their customers. So, and I want to say that the general mood from these legacy customers who are been using VMware is something akin to panic as to what they're going to do next.
Is it worth doing a quick show of hands in the room of how many people have got VMware workloads running today?
In production. Oh, okay.
So keep your hands up if you're worried.
Can we make sure we get them extra drink tickets for the? Yeah, no, there's a lot to worry about, and I want to say, Dinesh, you had some numbers about what Broadcom is looking to do with their
with revenue.
Yeah.
So VMware was currently running at, was it 4 point change billion revenue annually, and Broadcom is looking to increase that to 8.5 billion within 3 years. And
they are projecting that increase in revenue while decreasing their customer base by 2 orders of magnitude. They're looking to go from about, I think it was 100,000?
300,000 customers at the moment.
Down to 6,000?
Well, depends on which way you look at it. So the numbers I've been seeing is from Broadcom that they're focusing on 600 core accounts that they're expecting to not move. Another 6,000 accounts that they're expecting to be able to retain, and in their own words, 100,000 accounts to trail off over the next 3 years. And I don't know what trail off means.
Sounds pretty ominous. I'm not going to. Can I think about?
They've been pretty open about this.
Yeah, no.
Aren't they? This is actually out there. Them saying they're going to do this.
And to slice right through the numbers, what they're saying is these 600 accounts are going to be largely responsible for our increase in revenue by double, essentially. Now, I'm not a CFO of one of these 600 accounts, but if I was, I would feel probably ill-served by this turn of events. And Broadcom is not wrong in making this assertion that these 600 core customers have no choice.
I think it goes back to what you were saying this morning, Mark, wasn't it? About these customers.
Yeah, I guess so. I talked this morning, for those of you who were there, about, I suppose, lock-in being the key thing here. They don't have a choice. And, I talked about big tech maybe taking advantage of that situation. And this is just another example, I guess, of people don't have choice and big tech just trying to extract every penny they can out of what's left in a dying project, probably.
Yeah, and it is fair to say that VMware's day had come and gone, and was certainly on the backside of their impact. But like I said, Broadcom has made pretty much the right assertion in saying that these companies can't leave, because what has come in the place of VMware is more of the cloud-native space, is, some would argue, and some is me, needlessly complicated. To the point that adoption of Kubernetes as the not the aid, but the de facto heir to what VMware was doing, the entry point is extremely difficult on its face. And then if you have large enterprises with complex and diverse workloads, especially complex and diverse workloads that are making enough money to support a double in revenue, they're not really going to be keen to disturb that, especially for something that is going to have such a long lead time in even gaining enough skill to make good architectural decisions about what to do next.
I mean, I guess these companies that are out there at the moment that are running this workload have been through a cloud transformation already in the past probably 5-10 years, because it's what everyone has been doing. And the workload they now have left on VMware was chosen not to be cloud transformed.
And so, like I said, it's a good gambit on Broadcom's part, and they're right. The tendency is that when something is making money, and my former employer, Corey Quinn, would call it load-bearing technical debt. And load-bearing technical debt means it's bearing the load of the business on it. And you can't. And so I used to work in general contracting. You can't remove walls, some walls. Some walls you can move just fine. Load-bearing walls, you can't remove, right? You have to build around and shore the wall up in other places and redo parts of the foundation, redo parts of the roof, redo parts of everything else in order to be able to remove this wall. And it's so much work to do it that I have seen people demolish a house rather than move a wall, right? And that's what these companies are having to face. And so this is the scenario that we're in right now with VMware, but like I alluded to earlier, the only real choice they have is right now really is to move to Kubernetes, maybe, but that ecosystem is so laden with complexity, so saturated, I don't want, maybe saturated is not the word, but there are so many vendors of various aspects of this and this and this and this, that there is really a lot of decision paralysis just to know where to get started. And we have not done anything since the advent of Kubernetes to decomplicate this problem.
I guess it's not just Kubernetes as the only option, right? So there are other products out there that will allow you to host VM workload. What was the Red Hat OpenShift is an option to host VMs, but that gets you into a Red Hat environment.
Expensive.
Very
expensive Red Hat environment.
Expensive Red Hat environment that has been historically very friendly about licensing, right? Or is that another one?
Always, yeah. No, I was thinking about Red Hat and Oracle, best buddies and customer first.
So maybe that's not the best option of moving from VMware to Red Hat. Then there's Nutanix.
Yeah. There's quite a long Reddit thread. I think it's about 300 comments so far. And you can see everyone's responses to this and the different options they're looking at. And probably if you read through, there's different things being thrown out like Nutanix and OpenShift and Proxmox as an open source option. But I'd say every 5 that you read says, we're just going to pay up as well. You know, where they realize they've got no time.
Yeah.
The time is not on their side. Now, they might be planning in the background a migration. But even then, like you say, some of these very large enterprises have such complex systems. And it's not just about the infrastructure, it's about the design of their applications and the coding that has to be done to be cloud native and deploy into a cloud native world.
And then the skills gap of now you've got a group of VMware engineers that have been doing VMware and managing VMware for maybe 20 years. I don't know how well VMware is, but you know, it's a very long history that they have been investing their time, their energy, their certifications into VMware. And as an organization, you can't go to these same engineers and say, by the way, can you learn Kubernetes? Because tomorrow we're going to move all of our workload over.
Yeah. Not only can you learn Kubernetes, can you learn Kubernetes with the depth of experience and knowledge to be able to make the architectural decisions that we need to make around our application and our infrastructure and our processes and all these kinds of things that go along, not just involving where do I schedule work.
But these engineers aren't responsible today for application deployment. These engineers are looking after infrastructure, so they're network engineers and their virtualization expertise, and they're looking at things like PagerDuty or alerting. They're looking at vMotion, right? These are technologies that we're all aware of that have zero to do with application deployment.
Yeah. And so, like I said, we're describing this scenario, and I don't want to make it seem like all is lost and nothing can be done, because there have been some success stories. There have been folks who have done this move already and have utilized some of these technologies before. I don't. There's this one company called Civo that I happen to know a guy, and Mark, you talked about some of the success stories you've had around, or either in hosting or helping folks find like the right solution, and using either, whether it's traditional like open source cloud native technologies, but certainly a lot of the professional services and managed services around there, where they can look to say like, hey, we need some help with this, right? And folks who have reached out have had some successes.
Yeah, and I think the options are really limited. I think again, going back to that Reddit thread, there's only a handful of options out there, and 2 or 3 of those are very expensive options anyway. It might be cheaper than VMware, but not considerably cheaper.
Right.
And then you have some open source projects, but then you're going to be back on your own, really, things like OpenStack. And anyone who's ever worked with OpenStack, it's the most complicated thing, of a mixture of parts cobbled together to make a platform, and was built for virtualization and maybe has some cloud native functionality, but it wasn't its original purpose. So I think you've got some tough choices to make. And Civo, we have got an option, and I think in a way we do support traditional VM workloads, but we also have a path forward to a cloud native world, which is where we kind of started. Dinesh might be the better person to explain this than me, but we run the VMs within Kubernetes and using KubeVirt, which
so we are from the ground up. We call ourselves cloud native service provider. All of the tools that we use are cloud native technologies. So KubeVirt we use heavily. All of the infrastructure that we provision for our end users is backed by that project. That's the same KubeVirt project that is backing OpenShift as well, but is open source and donated to the CNCF. So there is a lot of contribution. There's a lot of the goodness of open source that, from a security point of view, you've got lots of eyes looking at this project and committing back.
So, and obviously I know we're at Civo, I don't want to sound like a Civo sales pitch, but I want folks to know that there are options out there, but especially if you are in one of these shops where you are using VMware for whatever reason, maybe you can't move everything, right? And it's probably realistic that you can't. But if you can move some stuff, some things, reduce that load, the financial load of VMware by utilizing some of the technologies, it's a good place to start, right? What was it? Perfect is the enemy of good, right? You don't have to get everything off, right? And this is how a lot of these companies end up here in the first place, is because they were doing cloud migrations, and like not everything can move, but whatever can move, someplace should. You have a lot of discussions that you're going to have to start having around architecture and around code and around the future, but I think what it kind of goes back to is, as an industry, we have moved further and further and further toward vendor lock-in of some kind or another, despite the burgeoning open source communities, because a lot of these things are open source because somebody wants to get people to work on a product until they can make it for pay, right? But even so, what percentage of folks out there have presence on AWS, right? What percentage of folks out there have presence in Google or Azure, right? And that's the only place they are, right? The object storage in S3 is somewhere in the exabytes now, right? If you have all of your object storage, all of your archives in S3, right, are you locked into Amazon? At 9 cents a gig for egress, I would say you are. And so the conversation we have is like what we're talking about right now. These companies are in this scenario not because of a technological problem itself, but because of an organizational resilience issue. They did not have building the organizational resilience to not be dependent on VMware. Broadcom knows this, and that's what they're exploiting.
And I think it's something outside of this that we all need to be aware of as we move forward and we move workloads off VMware, of where are you moving them to, and what lock-in are you willing to accept by doing that?
Yeah, and it becomes, like I said, becomes an exercise in what are we willing to risk, right? It is exactly risk mitigation.
Like you said as well, the Kubernetes kind of offers that part of that world anyway, but it's become very complicated at the same time. But I guess it's a step in the right direction because you've got multiple vendors, multiple suppliers, AWS, Azure, Civo, others, that offer a Kubernetes. There is a path. Part of the problem, though, is there's still a lot of proprietary technology that's kind of wrapped around that. So I think people have to make decisions as well about how they build their tech, because there are ways you can de-risk that.
Yeah.
You can build more things to be in cluster rather than outside of your clusters when you're doing these environments. So they're more portable when you move them around.
Yeah.
So I think decisions need to be made as well to lower the risk.
And I think that's the hard part, because there's this notion of when you're small, you can kind of move anywhere, right? And as you grow larger, as your technology starts making you money, right, you don't want to move it. You don't want to touch it, right? And then eventually when it gets to the point where you can't move it, you can't touch it, it's too late. But the idea that we have now, which is something that really wasn't available even 5 years ago, much less 10 years ago, is that notion of, we can just exist in a they call it a hybrid cloud environment, but basically a hybrid provider environment, right? You can nowadays deploy a container on any of the major cloud providers, on your own private cloud that you own, anything like that, or on a laptop, anywhere you want to, right? Now, the tooling and the architecture that goes behind that is by no means trivial, right? It is difficult, but it is a thing that has been unique in this industry that before that, like I said, 5 years ago, that wasn't an option. You had to lock into a vendor. You had to either be in a data center, or you had to be in Amazon, or you had to be in Google, because 5 years ago, nobody was in Azure. But even then, you had to either write and maintain separate code bases to work with everything, and now you don't.
I completely forgot.
That was good, though.
I had a point.
We were all shivering in anticipation.
So I think the nice thing about Kubernetes is that from the ground up, getting you to write applications that are going to expect failure, which is a really, really interesting paradigm, because you're used to having an application that was deployed to one web server, and that was fine, and it was in VMware, and you would live migrate it whenever you needed to do maintenance, and that was normal. You scheduled it on a Saturday night, it was fine. But with Kubernetes, you've got this idea of replicas, you've got the DNS moving traffic around the place. So once you move into this world of application delivery, the ability to have failure built in is really interesting.
Yeah. And I think the thing that we haven't, maybe we touched on with the S3 point, but the hardest part about moving this stuff around is, where does your data go, right? Because compute, for the most part, is going to be fairly agnostic. I can crunch numbers here, I can crunch numbers there, I can crunch numbers anywhere. Where do I put that? Where do I get the data from, and where do I put it when I'm done, right? And that literally has gravity, right? And I hate that I said that, but it does. And so, when we can talk about doing these transformations of architectures like that, we also really need to have a good story around how do we move gigabytes and terabytes and petabytes of data back and forth without having to literally mortgage your life away to pay for the network egress.
Yeah, and in one of our other businesses, we've got a data center, and there is one customer that has 6 racks of hardware deployed. One rack is entirely an HP storage array. One rack is a networking rack, and then they've got 4 racks of VMware. And you can move VMware, but what do you do about this HP SAN that is sitting there taking up an entire rack, that they've also got synchronous replication to one of our other sites? So they've got 6 racks in that data center, 1 networking, 1 storage, and 4 VMware racks.
They have dark fiber between the sites, but externally, no capacity.
No. And again, these are, don't purport that I sit up here and have any of these answers, because I don't, right? Because if I did, I would be a lot richer than I am now. But I think what we bring this to you at this conference because this is a problem the community has to solve. because I don't have all the answers, you don't have all the answers. You know, we're smart folks up here, but we don't have these answers. We're not sitting in any of the shoes of the people who are using VMware right now and are panicking, right? But we need to talk about this in the community, so the community will talk about it, so then the community can start working on answers or alternatives or any solution, right? This is not something specifically, this very issue is not something you want a vendor to fix, because then you are ending back up right where you were before. This needs to be a problem that the community needs to solve, and the community needs to solve it not just for how to get off of VMware, but it has to solve it for how you solve lock-in, right? And as a business, for me, if I run a business, the idea of having a solution for lock-in is very promising to me, because then I can now, when I go to AWS to renegotiate my EDP, lock-in is not a factor anymore, and I'm in a much stronger position. Or when, you know, your vendor gets acquired and someone tries to double, triple, quadruple the prices on you, you're like, actually, that's not a problem for me.
This stuff, I guess, goes around in circles, doesn't it? You mentioned Oracle. You know, is VMware just doing what Oracle did many years ago, and locking people in and price rises and all that kind of stuff? And then what happened to Oracle? They faded away. What's going to happen to VMware? It fades away. And it won't be the last company to do it. So yeah, we do have to plan for it. It's going to happen again. So like you said, it's the lessons learned. I think for me personally, it's back in the best of open source, and at least that takes you away from that proprietary lock-in. Back to Kubernetes again, and containers, and you know, you choose your preferred vendor to run those, but at least it's somewhat portable. I wouldn't say it's fully portable yet.
It's a good stepping stone to whatever comes next, right? You know, and very much in the way that they said it was going to be for, you know, when I did my cloud transformation, and now I can just port my VMs anywhere. Well, maybe, right? But at least with this, it's a good stepping stone to really true kind of like independence from a vendor. And the net result of this, I think, whenever the community can solve these problems, the community becomes much stronger, because agnosticity, I think, is really important for a lot of things. Again, we're going to bring it back to Kubernetes. Like, you know, Kubernetes was originally designed to do these things, right? And then it was like, well, I really like that idea, but I want to be able to run a database on it. And they were like, database on Kubernetes? Ha! Like, I actually remember these discourses where people say, you're crazy if you want to run databases on Kubernetes. And then, like, now pretty much every managed service database runs on Kubernetes, because they solve those problems. And that's the kind of thing you want to see. And that's the kind of thing that I think that we as a community can do, because we're smart people in this community now. You know, not to take away from like the other communities, they're fine too.
I guess there's also the governance side of things as well. There are countries, UK being one, Europe as well, that are looking at you know, removing things like egress fees from moving data around. Looking at more interoperability between providers, trying to reduce that lock-in. Because they're seeing the market share that some of these big tech companies have got, and the danger that poses to their own economies.
And Google have just announced that if you are leaving Google Cloud, that they will not charge you egress. Has anyone seen that? Did anyone read the fine print of what that actually means? You have to move all of your data, and it's something like you can't come back to Google for the next 3 years for any service. If you use something like Gmail, that would count as a service that you are keeping with Google, and therefore you have to pay your egress.
Well, isn't that lovely?
And it also says at their discretion.
Oh yeah, at their discretion.
But probably most importantly, it says you have to contact them, and you have to have a phone call about it. And what are they going to do at that point? Is then they're going to try and sell you, you know, a lower price, but lock you in for longer to make sure you don't leave. So you can't just move out. You have to have this whole conversation to move out. So it's probably going to ultimately drive them more revenue by locking people in even more.
Because you get the option of, you can move and you can pay these engineering costs over the next 3 months to move, or we'll give you a 50% discount over the next 3 years, and you can just leave it here and grow with Google.
So I think it's, you know, I think the main concern that you end up having is that at this point, your cloud providers basically get to set their own rules in a lot of ways because, again, they've got you in a locked-in situation, right? And it's like, for example, like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon their network egress is all like within a half a cent of each other, right? Half a cent a gig. And like, I've worked at Equinix, sorry about that. I've worked at Equinix before. I know how much data egress costs really per gig. These are made up numbers.
I think it's worse than that as well because there's a lot of peering that happens as well. So, the cost that they're buying transit is if it's going out onto the wide internet and then being transited across the world there. But there are these things called peering exchanges where Amazon and Microsoft and Netflix and AT&T will all be in a rack next to each other. There'll be a fiber between the two entities, and all of the data on that is free.
Yeah, it doesn't actually hop out anywhere, right? And but you're still paying for this. You're paying.
Yeah, they'll still charge you.
Yeah.
Because as far as you're concerned, you don't know where your traffic is going. It is leaving Amazon, it is leaving Google, so they will charge you for it.
Yeah, and I think what it comes down to these ways when we talk about having true agnosticity is, really the story of how do I as a startup, or how do I as a burgeoning business, or how do I as an established business, right, have as much control over my finances and my architecture as possible. These are business problems, they're human problems, these are essentially people problems that technology can help solve, which is why I feel like we're all here.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot, if you read about it, about companies suffering the consequences, especially smaller business, but medium-sized as well, that it's going to send them straight into the red, in terms of, if you've got a VMware bill that's multi-millions extra on renewal, that can be the difference between a profitable company and a loss-making company for some companies. And I was talking to someone yesterday that's affected by this VMware that's involved in a hosting company in Indonesia. And they were literally saying they might have to close their doors because unless they can pass on all these costs to their customers, how can they keep going? And we're hearing about 6x cost renewals. And then on top of that, they've killed their CSP community in terms of, I don't know what the numbers were, but it's going down from thousands and thousands of partners down to just a handful, I won't say a handful, but a few partners that are going to operate it. So that's kind of damaged the whole ecosystem. And those partners are now having to buy through the few that are left. So they're now buying from their competitors. So the whole thing's a mess.
And those competitors are going to put a margin on it for admin time. So, you might get a 6x renewal plus 10% handling fee.
Yeah.
So back to the lesson, it's kind of like, it's just being careful of, I guess, I mentioned in my keynote this morning about big tech lock-in, because nothing stops another big tech company 5x in, 2x in, 3x in. As I mentioned, AWS have started charging for IP addresses that's going to earn them $1 billion next year in extra revenue.
And literally all they're doing is writing a number next to something, and then now it's instant profit.
Yeah.
And it's worth considering that Broadcom knew all of this, right? They would have done all of the due diligence process. They would have done all of this to work out which customers could not move. They'd have been talking to SEs before they did this. They came out pretty much on the day of acquisition, naming these 600 companies that they knew could not move.
So I think, to kind of wrap all this up a little bit, the Broadcom acquisition of VMware is going to expedite the process of VMware's irrelevance. And like I said, that's been in the works, right? But it's going to do it on the backs of these 600 companies, and they're going to laugh all the way to the bank.
Right, because again, Broadcom knew that VMware had a shelf life. There was an end of VMware, whether it's 5 years or 10 years, they still decided to buy it for $69 billion, and they're going to make that back.
Yeah. And so the impetus goes then on the community of folks and, practitioners and consumers of this to say, like, we don't want to do this again. We've done this enough times. Because the impact of this is not just numbers on the spreadsheet. It's going to end up impacting people's lives. It's going to end up people's futures and livelihood. And those are the things why it makes it important for the community to be able to solve these problems.
And can I say as well that I think they laid off, it was a couple thousand people overnight, and they all got that by email. I think when a company's going to start being responsible, in terms of their ethics and their employees and, their customers, and, I'm as ambitious as the next person to run a business and do well and make money ultimately, but not at the expense of treading on every single person around you to get there.
Yeah.
I think there's, there's big techniques to find some ethics.
I wholeheartedly agree. I wholeheartedly agree with that. So I know we have a little bit of time left. I know we've said a lot. I want to know if anybody has questions for us.
There is a question and there's a mic on the way.
Good, because all I can see are lights.
All right.
And there are 4 lights.
Get a suntan.
Yeah, take your pick.
So my name is Paul, and my question is it possible for the community to enforce transparency and margins? You were saying that the numbers around data egress especially they're made up numbers. Is there some way that the community can say, no, we don't tolerate that anymore? You tell us how much money you make off of this, and we decide whether we want to use you.
So companies are allowed to keep this under what they will call a trade secret, right? And it's the same thing, like, how many people have gone to spin up an instance at AWS only to find out that there were no instances available, right? Now, when you've done this, AWS, when you ask them, they will say, we cannot publish our capacity, right? But if you work at AWS, you know exactly how much capacity is. There's a little report you can run in a dashboard like that. But that is one of the trade secrets that they will not do. I worked at AWS. I have a vague idea, not exact idea, a vague idea of what the actual cost of the network egress is. But it is such a guarded secret that even though I'm not covered by MD&A, I do not want that smoke, right? So as a community, we probably can't make them reveal that. As a pool of consumers, we can vote with our dollars. And that's kind of the hope with some of the vendor lock-in stuff, is that when you have a choice to not be on AWS after all of your data is there, if you say, well, we're actually going to leave because you're charging us too much for network, and we don't know why, right? That's the thing they can change. And has anyone here ever been on a private pricing agreement with AWS that you know of? Have you ever seen the text of it? It's private pricing agreements for AWS. That network egress price is very, very flexible. Very flexible. So it is arbitrary, and I'm not saying it's punitive, but it's certainly a margin helper.
Great question.
Yeah.
All right, what other questions? Yeah, great.
Can you talk about customer desire for decreased overhead via managed services compared with decreased desire for lock-in? Like, it feels like those are in tension sometimes.
Ooh, so kind of like, is it worth the money to not have to worry about it? That's always the thing, isn't it? Time is money. We make that choice every day with any number of managed services, and down to Uber Eats, right? So the easy / cliche answer is always going to be, it depends. And unfortunately, it does, because it depends.
Isn't it down to tolerance?
Was that tolerance or the complexity that you're trying to not have to deal with?
The smaller company versus a bigger company, the tolerance to pay that bill. And some will have no choice. They need to get off. They need to save money. They're going out of business.
Yeah.
Others will pay up because they can afford to. Maybe they have a migration plan later. Maybe they don't. I guess it will depend on certain situations, but
And it's what their tolerances over and how fast they actually have to do it, right? If you have a long runway, right, you don't necessarily have to pay as much, you can take some more time. If your runway is very short as far as time, right, and you have money, you will exchange those two. And that's always been the calculus. And I wish there was some easy way to say it, but say this is what you do, this is what the right situation to do, but it does depend, and it is a very complex calculation. But that's a great question. I just wish somebody had a good answer for it.
The infamous, it depends. All right, question? Okay, I'm coming.
Hallmark of a principal engineer right there.
Hi, guys. I was wondering, when I look at VMware vSAN, and in particular live migration of more traditional workloads is like the killer feature. So in your experience with storage and KubeVirt VMs, what are you seeing as far as in cases where people need that ability to survive physical hardware failure and then migrate an instance? You have that capability now, and then, or what are people looking at in the open source community or just as alternatives? What do you hear? What do you see?
And I think like this is where VMware has had so much experience, and they've got a great product for this with the the vMotion. You've got the I can't remember what the technology is, but the always on replica, so that you've got a VM, it's copied over onto another host. You're doing async memory replication and everything, and then as soon as one fails, it is just running again at the other host, like live. And as an open source community, we don't have anything like that. And it's going to be for the community to build that or come and say, we want this, we need this, and we're going to put time and effort, and someone's going to have to put their hand in their pocket and fund it, and either keep it to themselves or decide this is going to be great for the community and I'm going to give it back.
And I think it's important to note that you can string enough technologies together to make this happen. Like you can run ZFS, and then you can run a series of other things to take this block, this set of blocks, this block store, migrate it to somewhere else in the file system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? I've built this before, and I drank. Right? This patch of gray hair right here is probably just from that. And it's not easy at all. It's complex. And that's why they charge so much for the solution, right? But to your point, we really need to look at the community to say, like, these are the problems that enterprises had in the past that we're paying other people to solve, and maybe the community can handle this instead.
But is this a legacy technology that's not really worth the investment in solving that? And we need to move forward into cloud native.
I dare say I could probably find 600 companies that would say yes as a product. But yeah, that's a great question, though. I appreciate it. Anybody else?
Any other questions? Don't be shy if so.
And now it's the grappling tournament, right? It was supposed to be me and Dinesh.
Was it grappling?
Grappling, yeah.
I thought it was Beyonce.
Oh, that's.
Is that your walk-off song that you're requesting?
Oh yeah,
Is that the request?
do we have the do you guys have the Beyonce honky tonk song?
Texas Hold'em?
Texas Hold'em,
Yes, that does sound.
Yeah. I don't know. That would be great. I don't have a good ending for this. I thought that was gonna be great. It plays that we walk off and,
Oh, it ain't.
Look at that, my man, my man.
Okay.
I love it.
Thanks, everyone.